Okay, so today we're going to be talking about where did the Old Testament come from? And of course it came from the bookstore, right? It came from, Lifeway Christian Bookstore. It came from Mardell's if you live in Texas. Obviously that's true, but that's not what I mean by this message. Where this came from was I wanted to do a study because I had been seeing online on social media a lot of people posting memes about, people like to pick on the New International Version, the NIV. And so there were lots of memes talking about, they removed this verse from the scripture and they removed this verse from the scripture. And when you do a study on New Testament translations, you start to see that the translators weren't actually sitting there, oh, we don't like that verse, let's take it out. It's not that simple. We have different translations because the translators were going through different manuscripts. There's multiple flavors of manuscript traditions, and when you use some texts and not the other texts, you're going to end up with verses that are missing or verses that are added just because they're in the text that you're drawing from. So that study is going to come next month, but I wanted to do the Old Testament version of that first because old comes before new. So today we're just going to kind of do this is going to be just a brief overview just to kind of whet everyone's appetite. If you guys decide, that you want to delve into this in more detail later, let me know, and we can put together a more detailed teaching on each of these items. So the Old Testament, as we know it, is basically three manuscript traditions. There's what we call the Septuagint, which is essentially the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's more complicated than that, but that's generally what the Septuagint is. Then you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are in Hebrew, and they go back to prior to the second Temple time, just a couple centuries BC, and then up into the Second Temple age there. And then we've got the Masoretic text. Now, the Masoretic text, when we read our English Bibles, whether it's King James, whether it's NIV, whether it's New American Standard, English Standard, whatever it is, they all come from the Masoretic. It's the one that we all know. So we're going to just kind of get into these and just kind of give a little bit of history and background, and we're going to talk about some translational things with them. And then, like I said, if you guys want to go deeper in this, let me know. And then down the road in later months, I can put together a more in-depth study, and we can really go down that rabbit hole. It's a fascinating rabbit hole. So we'll talk about the Septuagint first. The Septuagint, what happened during the Hellenistic age, you had a lot of Jews who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, in Egypt. And at that time, Egypt had been conquered by Greece. So you had, the history of Alexander the Great. He conquered a lot of land, and then after he died, that land was split up among his four generals. So this is where you get like the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire. I forget the other two. They were all named after his top four generals. So we're down in Egypt. This is the Ptolemaic Empire. And so you had a whole lot of Jews living in Alexandria, and there was the king at the time was Ptolemy II, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and he reigned from 285 to 246 BCE, or BC. And so basically, the story goes, the reason why they call it the Septuagint, and you'll see it sometimes in the Roman numerals, it'll be LXX, that's 70. And so there was a letter written by a historian that claimed that Ptolemy II wanted to get a copy of the Torah for the Jews that lived in Alexandria. So he sent off to the land of Israel, and he brought over 70, some say 70, some say 72, but he brought over 70-ish scribes, translators, to come over. He quartered them, he put them in lodging, and the legend is that they had the entire Torah, the first 5 books, translated perfectly into Greek in 70 days. So there's a lot of 70s in this legend. Now I say legend because we can't confirm some of this historically. We do know that Ptolemy II commissioned it. We do know that he brought Jewish scholars in from Israel to actually do the translations. But how many he brought in, how long it took him, and part of the legend is that he put each scholar, each translator in a separate room. They were working all independently, and they came up with a letter-for-letter, word-for-word match on the translation for all of them. So that's a miraculous feat if it were to be true, but we don't have evidence that it is true. And actually, as we go through this, we're going to see that it's probably not true because the Septuagint does have some issues. It's not perfect. I like it a lot, but it's not a perfect translation. The Septuagint has everything that we have in our English Old Testaments, plus it's got the apocryphal writings. So it's going to have the book of Tobit, it's going to have Maccabees, it's going to have the wisdom of Sirach, otherwise called Ecclesiasticus. It's got things like that in it. And so basically what happened was the initial translation endeavor by Ptolemy was to have just the first 5 books done. So they started there. That's the oldest core of the Septuagint. And then over the next couple centuries, they kept working at it. They eventually got into the histories, Kings and Chronicles, things like that. They got into the prophets. Then they started to get into the apocryphal writings. So it didn't happen overnight. It took centuries for the actual Septuagint to all be translated. And by the time we get into Second Temple times, when Messiah was walking the earth, it's generally accepted that the Bible that people had in their hands the most, because it was a Greek-speaking empire at that point, would have been the Septuagint. And so we're going to take a look at some of the stuff here in a minute translationally that points to the idea that the New Testament writers were more familiar with the Septuagint than they were maybe some of the other Hebrew writings. In the Septuagint, I brought a couple copies of it up here if anybody wants to take a look after the teaching. I've got a New English translation, it's the one I read from if I'm going to read. It's got some commentaries and things. Each translator goes through on the book that they translate, and they give detailed notes on the history of the manuscripts, how they, the methods that they use to translate, things like this. And what we find when we look at that is that some of the books, like Daniel and Esther, they have additions. And the reason I put that in air quotes is because they're a lot longer than what we read in the Masoretic text, and so scholars call them additions. In my opinion, we don't know for sure if they're additions or subtractions because we don't have the original manuscripts to compare them to. These are all manuscripts that, as ancient as they are, they're still hundreds of years after the originals. So when we see that, Daniel has more chapters in it in the Septuagint than it does the Masoretic, in my opinion, how can we say that they were added? Maybe they were taken away in the Masoretic. It's up in the air, at least to me. But Daniel, Esther, they have extra chapters. Some of them even have more than one Greek version. So it's like today, if I say, we have the English Bible, that could mean anything. It could mean a number of translations. Some people count the Apocrypha in their Bible, so maybe I'm talking about the Apocrypha, maybe I'm not. It's a really fluid thing. And it's like that when we talk about the Septuagint. When you get into Daniel, there are 2 translations that are Septuagint related. There's what's called the Old Greek, which is the most ancient, and then there's a translator named Theodotion who did a translation of Daniel and some other books. When you look at Daniel specifically, Theodotion's translation lines up more with the Hebrew that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic. The Old Greek translation is quite a bit different, and they have some extra chapters. Same thing with Esther. Esther is a lot longer in the Septuagint, and it's got some more background and things. So it's really interesting. And like I said, these are up here if anybody wants to come up and have a look later. Bryce has a copy of the Septuagint that matches mine, so if we got a lot of interest, would you mind letting people see yours too? Okay, cool, thank you. So we're going to do a little exercise here. We're going to go to Luke chapter 4. And I'm going to read from the New Testament. You guys are going to go to the Old Testament. You guys are going to go to Isaiah 61. And you guys are going to read verses 1 through 2. So I'm going to read, you'll see what I mean as we go through here. I'm going to start in Luke 4, and I'm going to start reading at 16:21. This is where Joshua comes up and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue. So I'm going to read Luke 4, 16 through 21. And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written. This is where you guys are going to read. The Spirit of the Lord, or of Yahweh, is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who were oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of Yahweh. And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Now, you guys were reading from the Old Testament. Did you guys notice anything different from what I read in the New Testament? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 2. The key part that I catch is in the New Testament, he talks about, he has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. Now, in your English Bibles in Isaiah 61, you're probably not going to see that phrase. You're not going to see anything about recovery of sight to the blind. So this, to me, is significant, and this is why it's important to have resources like the Septuagint when we're doing New Testament studies and even Old Testament studies, because we see the miracles that Yahshua did when he went around. One of those was healing a man born blind. He healed people that were blind, from later on, but he also healed a man born blind. And if we have like an imaginary checklist of all the things the Messiah is going to do when he comes to earth, and if you're living in Judah at that time and people are telling you that this man going around is the Messiah, you're going to have these things in your head that you're like, okay, well, let's see if he does this. Let's see if he does this. And so when he goes and heals the man born blind, that only checks off your messianic checkbox if you're familiar with the Septuagint or the Hebrew document that predates the Septuagint, because remember, it was translated from Hebrew at some point. So maybe you know what the Old Hebrew said, maybe you have the Septuagint. Either way, when you read in the Septuagint, which is an exact match from what it says there in Luke, then when you see him heal somebody born blind, it's gonna go, winner, chicken dinner time, I guess. It's going to be an exact match. If they were to have had the Masoretic, or whatever the Masoretic was based on when they translated Isaiah 61, him going around and healing blind people is going to be lost on them. It's not going to be on their messianic checklist. So it's cool that he healed blind people, but it's not going to be as monumentous as it was when they go into Isaiah and they say, whoa, he just did Isaiah 61. Does that make sense? So little things like this are important. When we go into, also in Isaiah, when we have the prophecy of Emmanuel, okay, there's debate. A lot of the mainstream Jews reject the idea that he was born of a virgin, because in the Hebrew, it's not a word for virgin. It's a word for young woman. She can be a virgin, but she doesn't have to be. But in the Greek Septuagint, the word there specifically means virgin. It's a technical term. There's no other thing it can mean. So the Septuagint talks about Emmanuel being born of a literal virgin. You don't see that in the Masoretic. So, in my opinion, when we get into the Septuagint, we see language that more clearly points to what we see in the New Testament with Yahshua coming and fulfilling his messianic role. We see more clear emphasis on some of these prophetic things and some of the roles that he would fulfill. So the Septuagint is really important. It matches the Masoretic, the Septuagint. I tried to find a chart. There used to be charts like this, and I can't find it. I suspect because the information has changed, and so maybe they've been pulled down because they're obsolete. But there used to be charts that you could look at where it'll say, like, the Septuagint agrees with the Masoretic this percentage of time, or the Septuagint agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls this percentage of time. And I can remember Michael Heiser doing a whole presentation on it. And I went to his blog, and now that he's passed away a couple years ago, there's some broken links and things like that, so I couldn't even find it through his site. So if anybody has any insight on where those charts are, I would love to have them as a reference. Maybe you can point me to them. But generally speaking, the Septuagint matches the Dead Sea Scrolls a percentage of the time. There's a percentage of the time where it matches the Masoretic. And then we'll see times where they disagree. So when we get into the New Testament, we see this more pronounced with some of the manuscripts that they pull from, but we also see it here a little bit too. Like with my New American Standard, when you read about how they did the translation process for that, they're using the Masoretic, but when the Lockman Foundation came along and did the NASB translation, they had access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had better access to Septuagint scholarship, because for centuries, people didn't really take the Septuagint seriously. Your average Bible scholar wasn't really getting into the Septuagint. but it's kind of had a resurgence lately. So more and more scholars are digging into the Greek Old Testament. And now that we've got more and more information on this, modern translators are starting to use that as a supplement to their translations. So the Lockman Foundation is going in and looking at the Masoretic Hebrew, and they're comparing it to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're comparing it to the Septuagint to try to make sure they have an accurate definition of the words and how they're used, context, idioms, things like that. So it's really important that we're understanding these kinds of things. When we get into the New Testament, there are approximately 90 direct, that's 90 as in 90 direct quotations in the New Testament that match the Septuagint over the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic, like word-to-word match. And there are about another 80 that paraphrase or allude to it. They're close matches, but not perfect. And this is New Testament tracking back to the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is really important to have on our toolbox when we go and we read and we study the New Testament, because there's going to be things in there that we're not going to see when we track it back to the Masoretic Hebrew. So that's the Septuagint in a nutshell. And like I said earlier, it's a fluid thing. Septuagint at its core is just those first 5 books that were translated under Ptolemy II's time. But then the Septuagint broader scope is pretty much all the Hebrew documents that were translated into Greek over a couple centuries. So, and that was a progression, like I said, through the histories, through the prophets, on up through the apocryphal things, and then we just kind of go from there. So when we talk about the Septuagint was the Bible in use during Second Temple times, it's generally true. But what we don't know is, Yahshua, if he was reading from not the New Testament, because it wasn't written yet. If he was reading from the Isaiah scroll, and if that was Septuagint Greek, which is possible. I tend to think he would have been reading from Hebrew in the synagogue, you would think, or at least Aramaic. But in any case, it's important to know that if the Septuagint was in circulation at that time, it may have been all of the books. It might have been some of the books. Just like today, there are people that will accept the 66 canonized scriptures but not accept the Apocrypha. There are people like myself there are certain apocryphal books that I do accept but not others. I just kind of look at them, on a case-by-case basis. And realistically, it was probably the same with the Septuagint at that time. We know that the Pharisees had more scriptures available to them than the Sadducees did. The Sadducees limited themselves to the first 5 books of Moses. So Septuagint or not, they weren't using all the other stuff. They weren't using the Apocrypha. They weren't using the prophets. They weren't using any of that. So there's a lot of variance in which books would have been in circulation and which ones would have been used. But just generally speaking, when somebody says the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they basically mean any Hebrew religious documents that were in circulation at the time. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we're going to move on to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I deliberately am not going too deep into this, because if we went deep into the Dead Sea Scrolls, we'd be here all day, because there's a lot. They discovered them in 1947 in the Qumran caves off the Dead Sea. That's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And over the decades, they've been finding more and more. They're finding more and more pottery fragments and scroll fragments in these caves. And it's been a really arduous task to get these translated. They've had some of the best people in the world, not just language translators, but also people with forensic investigation. If you've ever seen the TV show CSI, where they're using chemicals and things like that to read paper, this is the kind of thing that they're doing. And so it's a really specialized field. And we don't even, as far as I know, we don't even have access to all the scrolls right now, because I don't want to get too conspiratorial here, but a lot of it went into the hands of the Vatican. And they've slowly been releasing them over the decades. But as far as we know, they haven't released all of them. So that asks the questions, why are they not releasing all of them? I'll leave you guys to speculate on that. But the oldest fragment that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the caves, dates to 586 BCE. This goes back prior to the fall of Babylon. Babylon fell in 539 BCE. Okay? So it's in the caves, and it's part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's not a biblical text. So this is kind of like the Septuagint. The Septuagint was centuries in the making. Same thing here with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't just sit down and just write the Bible in Hebrew and put them in some pots and call it a day. So the bulk of the biblical texts, like the scroll of Isaiah, the other, the Torah, things like that, they found everything there except for the book of Esther. They haven't found the book of Esther. And the theory is because the book of Esther does not have the tetragrammaton in it. It doesn't have Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, Yahweh. And so one of the theories is that the Qumran community, because of that, didn't value it as inspired scripture. So they didn't feel the need to have it. Either that, or they didn't feel the need to protect it because it didn't have the holy name of our Creator in it. It could have been considered a more common document that didn't need to be stored in pots and didn't need to be kept safe. At that time, it's kind of hard for us to relate to, but at that time, you see this in some of the Jewish writings, some of the Mishnah, I believe. They talk about the scribes, when they would write the scriptures, when they would come up to the name of the Creator, they would do a mikvah. They would do a ritual immersion to be ritually clean, and then they would write Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, and then they would continue. And the next time they got to a Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, they would stop, they would ritually purify. Like, we talk about sacred namers today in the context of the Hebrew roots Torah thing. Sacred namers back there make us look like a bunch of simpletons with their dedication and their level of reverence for the name. So it makes sense that they would have kept any documents with the holy name in pots to protect them from the elements, but the book of Esther doesn't have that in it. Well, it's okay if we lose that copy. We'll just do another one. Like I said, the bulk of it dates from about 332 BCE to about 63 CE or AD, Common Era, AD, however you want to, depending on how politically correct you want to be. So just like the Septuagint, it was centuries in the making. They started off probably with the Torah, maybe some of the prophets, and then over time they started to work in more of the history. They started to work in more of the Apocrypha. With the Apocrypha, there's a couple more books at least that are considered apocryphal that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not part of the Septuagint. The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls were kind of overlapping. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have the book of Enoch, specifically First Enoch, or at least fragments of it. I think they have most of it, and the book of Jubilees. The Septuagint does not have those books. So why that would be is something I don't know, but it's just something to take note of. They also have what's called sectarian writings. Like with the Septuagint, it's all scripture of some kind. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't just have scripture. They had what's called the community rule. The community rule, I think it's also called the Damascus document, was basically, hey, here are the rules of our community. Here's how we're going to interact with each other. If we think of the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower and we think of the Mayflower Compact, that was a contract that everybody had to sign if they were going to come over here to settle in Plymouth. And it's how do you work out disputes, property rights, things like that. These are included in things like the community rule. They also had the temple scroll, which talks about different temple-related rituals that we don't find in the scriptures. And they had other texts like this that basically dealt with day-to-day life. How do we interact with each other? And they had documents that really were hard and heavy against the leadership in Jerusalem. If you know the history of the Dead Sea community, basically, at some point in history, they had enough of how things were going in Jerusalem. This was in the Hellenistic period when the Greeks had kind of come in at the time of like the Maccabean revolt, Jonathan Hyrcanus, that time frame. And basically, they had started to Hellenize Judaism. And so the Sadducees, by the time we get to Yahshua's time, they were kind of more politically connected. They were a priestly class, but they were politically connected because of coming through that period of the Hellenization. And generally, whoever the Qumran community was, whether it was Essenes, whether it was somebody else, they opted out of that system, and they basically said, you guys can have Jerusalem, we're going to come out here, and we're going to be holy to our God. And so that's what they did. They went out, they moved to the caves, they established their own priesthood. In modern times, people are talking about this being the sons of Zadok, the Zadok priesthood. in my opinion, there's some room to debate that, but it's something that's going around. And with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they even have like their own calendars, because like we said, they've got Enoch, they've got Jubilees, those both have calendars in them. And so this is relevant to bring up to me because we have a book, it's called The Fallacy Detective. And I need to read it. I need to bring it sometime where I can just show everybody because I allude to it frequently. But it's talking about a bunch of different logical fallacies. And a logical fallacy that pertains to these scriptures, and why I wanted to kind of bring them up, was, when we talk about the Hebrew texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls are obviously older than the Masoretic. We'll get into this in a minute, but the Masoretic scriptures were done around 1000 CE or 1000 AD, long after the Septuagint, long after the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so the idea is, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest Hebrew we have, therefore they must be the most accurate. Well, logically, that's not necessarily true. Just because they're older than the Masoretic doesn't mean they're more accurate. It just means they're older than the Masoretic. So we have to be careful when we look into these texts that we don't make logical assumptions like that are not necessarily provable. So it's important to note, because when we look at the whole calendar debate that we deal with, some people will look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and they'll say, well, they have a calendar that's older than what they were doing during Second Temple times, therefore it must be more accurate. Maybe it is more accurate, but we don't know for sure just because they're older. We would really, to test that and really prove it, we would need to have the original manuscripts that the Septuagint came from and the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. We would need to go back further to that. And as far as I know, unless Pope Francis is sitting on it in Rome, we just don't have those copies. So that's important to know. It's really cool with the Dead Sea Scrolls because they've got some of the fragments that are actually in Paleo-Hebrew. And this is kind of how we're starting to learn about how ancient Hebrew worked. You can actually see, I've got it on my wristband here, I don't know if anybody can see this, but I've got Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh in Paleo-Hebrew. We're learning about that from documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are other things around. There's steles, I think. I forget where they're at. A stele is basically a stone little monument with some writings on it, but that have the Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh in Paleo. But they also have a lot of block Hebrew. Not the modern Hebrew that we see like in Tel Aviv or whatever, but like what we see in the Masoretic text later. So that's important to note. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's it in a nutshell. I don't have any copies of the Dead Sea Scroll that I thought were worthy to bring. I've got like a soft cover book that's got like translations and stuff, but it's not, to me, we've had better scholarship since that was published, so I don't necessarily rely on it too much. But if you're interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a whole lot of information. If you've heard of Emmanuel Tov, if that name rings a bell to anybody, he's one of the leading translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He lives in Israel. Has anyone heard of Nehemiah Gordon? That name ring a bell? As I understand it, I see some hands. As I understand it, Nehemiah Gordon actually was helping Emmanuel Tov go through the Dead Sea Scrolls translations. And Nehemiah Gordon is pretty open to questions as far as I know. So if you want to dig deeper into the Dead Sea Scrolls, Nehemiah Gordon might be a resource. Emmanuel Tov has some books. There's lots of scholarship on it. There's a website, I forget the name of it. I'll see if I can put it as a link on the YouTube version of this when I post it. But there's a link that's got like all of the Dead Sea Scrolls scanned, where you can go and look at scans of all the actual manuscripts, the fragments and things. And then it's got translator notes and things like that. If I can remember, I'll grab a link and put that in the video. And if I forget, somebody feel free to remind me. I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. The Hebrew. I'm sorry, there's echo.
He's asking if what you just said, the scans are part of the Nehemiah Gordon's.
Probably, yeah. Because when he was working with Emmanuel Tov, they would have been going over these manuscripts, and they only let certain scholars come in. It was really like because they're ancient. Like these things are so ancient that you could, and I'm only slightly exaggerating here. If you look at them, they'll just crumble to ash. You know, they're that delicate in some cases. So they were really guarded with who they let actually have access to the fragments for translation. Most people that are part of the translation process just have access to scans. The originals are off limits because they don't want them to deteriorate. So now we're going to move into the Masoretic. The Masoretic, it's called that because there was a school of scribes called the Masoretes. And you see different histories depending on the source. When we get into rabbinical stuff, like you can have 5 rabbis and have 8 different opinions. This is just how they are. So when you start to get into their writings about certain things, it gets a little muddy pretty quickly. But as I understand it, the Masoretic school of scribes tracks itself back to Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva was active in the 2nd century during like the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we'll talk about that here in a minute. But by the time you got around to 1000 CE, 1000 AD, you had multiple schools of scribes and translators in a few different towns in Israel. There was one school in Tiberias, and they are the ones that translated what we have as a Masoretic today. So they tracked their lineage back to a family called Ben Asher. We don't know a ton about that family. We do know that they were scribes. And just kind of what I've seen anecdotally, they traced their history back to Rabbi Akiva and his school. The Jewish legends say that Rabbi Akiva had anywhere between 12,000 to 24,000 disciples. Now, that's a lot of disciples. I don't know if that's true or not, but we do know that he had a lot of influence. He's considered one of the most influential rabbis up until you get into like Rambam, Maimonides, those types. So a lot of influence there. The Masoretic usually matches the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text, they're going to match a lot more than, like, say, the Masoretic would with the Septuagint. It's not perfect, it's not bulletproof, but there is a higher degree of matches, especially when we only look at consonants. And that's important because the Masoretic text is where we get the vowel markers from. Okay? So going back to Nehemiah Gordon, he's looking at these manuscripts and he's going back as far as he can get Hebrew manuscripts that have vowel markers, because when you don't have the vowel markers, it's tough to say sometimes how they would have pronounced the vowels. Like when we look at Yod He Wah He, there's debate to this day on how do we say that. Do we say Yahweh? Do we say Yahuwah? Nehemiah would advocate Yehovah. And basically, and there's other variations than that. But one of the reasons why these scribes decided to put vowel markers into the text was to help eliminate some of this stuff, to help pin down the pronunciation. Like if you take in Hebrew, Mem, Lamed, I think it's Kaf. In English, we would say MLK, not Martin Luther King, but MLK. That can be Malik for king. It can be Melik for messenger. And it can be Molech. Like you burn your children to Molech. It's the same root letters. So it's important to know how you're going to pronounce the word if you're going to make sure you're talking about the right thing. So they decided to go ahead and put things in, and I'll just kind of briefly get into what they did here. They put markings in that indicate the punctuation of the text into clauses and sentences. They call this biblical accents. So if anyone's looked at like Hebrew text, if you have like a Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, it'll be in Hebrew, like Hebrew block letters. You read it right to left instead of left to right. There's no commas, there's no periods, there's no colons. It's just like one long run-on sentence. And so you have to understand where the word breaks are just habitually as you read to be able to read something like that. The Masoretes put little marks and stuff in to help kind of break out clauses and phrases to make it a little bit easier for people to read. They did markings that indicate all the vowels that go with each consonant and the precise way in which that consonant is to be pronounced. This is called vowel pointing. And so I have not learned Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew. I can read certain words. But I do know people that you can turn them loose with a copy of a Masoretic scripture, and they will just bang it out, And I've watched them do it, and any of you that have done this will see this. There are some times when you'll have a Hebrew consonant and you'll have a vowel, and the vowel actually changes how the consonant is pronounced. Like if I say, if I have, in English, if I have H-O-T and I have H-A-T, okay? H is considered a consonant in English. The fact that I have an O or the fact that I have an A doesn't change how I pronounce the H. It's still an H. But in Hebrew, you have cases where it does. So they made markings that indicated not just how to sound the vowels out, but how to pronounce consonants in certain circumstances. They put notes on the side of the text to indicate different ways of reading the text and that have unusual features. This is called the Masora Parva or the Lesser Masora. So these are basically just little commentaries that they put sometimes in the margins, basically saying, and like if I look at my New American Standard, I'll be reading through and it will have like a little postscript A, a little postscript B. And when I go down to the bottom of my page, it'll say more accurately, da-da-da, and it will give me an alternate rendering of that word in English. They were doing things like that in the text to kind of help the reader along. They also put notes at the top and bottom of the pages with references to other verses that have the unusual features. And when I say unusual features, when you read the Old Hebrew, sometimes you'll just be reading along and all of a sudden there's one letter that's really big. It's like, what happened there? Did the scribe sneeze and just big letter? Like, they put notes in explaining things like that. When you see in the book of Genesis, we hear I am the Aleph and the Tav, or the Alpha and the Omega in the Greek, the Aleph and the Tav. When you see in the book of Genesis, you actually see that inserted there in Genesis chapter 1. And if you just read it by itself as a word, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So they'll have notes in there that kind of talk about why these things are in the text and kind of how to interpret them. So they kind of went the extra mile to make sure that when people read the text, they had the tools that they needed to not only pronounce things correctly and say things correctly, but maybe to get a little bit of context. It's similar in some way to like the Schofield Bible when he first came out. That was the first Bible that I'm aware of in English that had footnotes and that had commentary and things like that in it. They were doing something similar, just in a different way. Now, this is inconclusive, and I mentioned this earlier. If we track the Tiberias school that translated the Hebrew into the Masoretic text, they may have been influenced by Rabbi Akiva's school. And this is important, especially when we get into the New Testament. We were talking about in the Septuagint earlier how there are certain things in the Septuagint that clearly point towards what we see in the New Testament fulfillment of Messiah, like the virgin birth, things like this. When we get into the Masoretic, there are several scriptures, and I won't go into them here or else we could be at it all day, but like I said, if you guys want to go down this rabbit hole some more, we can do a more detailed study later. But there are certain things in the text that if we were to read it in the Septuagint, clearly point to the Messiah that we see in the New Testament. When we read our Masoretic text, a lot of those scriptures are not there or they're changed. And so one of the theories is, and I want to emphasize theory because I can't say for sure this is true, but one of the theories is because Rabbi Akiva was a supporter of Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, therefore he would not be a supporter of Yahshua of Nazareth as the Messiah. Maybe that influence led the scholars that did the Masoretic to alter the text a little bit to point away from Yahshua and maybe point more towards Bar Kokhba. It's possible. Can we prove it? I don't think we can prove it conclusively. But there is enough smoke there to maybe wonder, is there a fire? So that's why it's important, I think, when we do these studies of like the Old Testament, we don't take it for granted that the Bible that we have in our hands is everything we need. I think it's adequate, obviously for salvation, for reproof, these things like this. But if we're going to really get down and try to go deep, this is where I think it's kind of like, I think of like the book of Esther, for such a time as this. There hasn't really been another generation that's had access to the materials that we have. Copies of the Septuagint with the Septuagint scholarship that goes along with it, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls 200 years ago. They didn't even have them 100 years ago. They were just sitting there in some caves and nobody knew about them until the little Bedouin boy threw his rock in and heard a clatter of one of the pots breaking. That's the story anyway. So the point with all this is that when we do our studies, it's important to be aware of where the Old Testament came from. And in this case, our Old Testaments that we have in our English, they pretty much exclusively come from the Masoretic tradition. But the Old Testament as a whole, just as a concept, also comes from the Greek Septuagint, also comes from the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I wanted to put this out here just as kind of a primer kind of on the different manuscript traditions that come into the Old Testament and kind of how they relate, their history, their background, and their importance today. Like I said, this is not a deep teaching. It's not a huge, detailed, deep dive, but I wanted to put this out there. Next month, we're going to get into the New Testament, and that gets a little spicier. Because in the New Testament, we've got the Textus Receptus, which is basically where the King James came from. And then we've got some other manuscript traditions that the other translations come from, like the NIV, like the New American Standard, the New Revised, things like this. They come from different places. And so next month, we're going to take a look into the New Testament. And with that one, because we have a little bit more to work with in modern times, the scholarship is a little bit more set and settled. We're going to be able to kind of go a little deeper in that one than we did with this one. I deliberately didn't go that deep with this one because we're dealing with hundreds of years of manuscript history, and there's no way we're even possibly going to be able to get into detail in one sitting on a beautiful Sabbath day. So I'll close it at that. I know it's relatively short. You guys are used to 4 hours. This is probably half an hour, 45 minutes max. But at this point, hopefully you guys have taken some notes. I'll open the floor for questions, comments, strong opinions.